Hello, my name is Brian Cam, and I am a writer, podcaster, and increasingly someone who is kind of mired in philosophy. And I am going to talk today about what I have been working on lately. I actually tried to do this yesterday and kind of failed because I started later in the day and had already done a podcast with a friend of mine in the morning. And that turns out to not be the best way to start talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. Now, I've possibly picked the worst day ever because there seems to be someone putting up scaffolding outside. I've got this like sound shield thing that a friend of mine gave to me, and I have no idea whether it is actually effective or not. But I'm hoping to just kind of do a draft and like not be too stressed about these lectures, because these things, what I want them to be is a way of kind of sharing with you what I'm up to live, and to just kind of not be too attached to making them perfect, not scripting them. This morning I was thinking, oh, should I do some slides or something like that? And I think slides are probably a great idea for me because I tend to go off on tangents. And I think there's a lot of things I could do to improve what I'm working on. But for now, I want to be okay with just trial and error and working in public and not feeling too uptight about getting everything right. So at least I am hoping that this is recording my sound. It looks like it is. And I am appearing on screen, which it looks like I am. And so I think I'm just going to start talking. Now, over the past few months, lots of people have asked me what it is that I'm working on. And there's no like short answer, basically, or at least the way I think of it is like, how long do you have? Because if you have like several hours and you're interested and can ask me questions, then I'm definitely happy to to answer questions about anything you might want to know about what I'm working on. But if what you're really asking for is a kind of maybe like 2 to 3 minute summary of what I've been up to, I don't yet have that because it's just a little bit too big and messy in my head. And if what you want is something more like a one-liner about what are you actually doing, I've tried out various one-liners. Sometimes I say I'm working on history of epistemology, which is like a history of how we know things or different, methods of knowing. At other times I'm like, yeah, like history of philosophy or history of science, or I'm working on cultural evolutionary theory, or I'm thinking about the question of suffering, like when did suffering start and why do we seem to suffer more than other animals, which has been a long-standing question for me. Why do certain complex things tend to persist in time and become durable or even anti-fragile? And why do other things seem to kind of fade out? More recently, I've been looking at Nietzsche's view on the self, and which in my view also has some relation to David Hume's, which is a very anti-self kind of view, which relates to Buddhism. And I've been doing a lot of dependent origination stuff in Buddhism, which is another topic I would love to kind of get into at some point. I've even been thinking about like, should I like record meditations? Because one aspect of all of this, even though I'm going into these very abstract things, very old cultural history, trying to get at the origins of things, the origins of ideas, concepts, movements, in order to unpick them and say, like, what was the culturally specific context in which these things arose? What kind of problems were they answering? And then combining that with a kind of pragmatist attitude, not just like a commitment to pragmatism sort of a priori as I read philosophy, even though I do a little bit have that. So I have this kind of, and I do worry that it's just like, it's just because I'm American, I have this kind of like inclination towards action. I have, the thing that brought this to mind is just the Buddhist dependent origination stuff, which every time I read it before, I was like, it seems like there's something in there. It's like these 12 stages, and maybe they're cosmological, or maybe they're about multiple human lives, about how ignorance leads to suffering. Those are the kind of headlines of this view. But more recently, I've been looking at work by Lee Brasington and a few other people, Buddhadasa, I think his name is, who are looking at what's called the moment-by-moment interpretation of dependent origination. So you see these 12 steps or 12 links in a, it's not really a chain, like it's a very Western thing to say, oh, maybe it's this like beginning to end kind of thing. And what we're talking about is like a bunch of causal steps. That is actually not what it looks like the Buddha's on about. And these are from the very early suttas. So these are things that, you know, it's a very long time ago, you know, sort of, what is it, 500 BC. And his followers spent about, I'm not sure the exact timelines, but I think it's like 150 years of oral tradition before anything was written down. So a bit like you might have heard the Gospels, I think they're written down like 80 years before Christ. So even though they have this quite vivid sensation, like something's happening right now, there's actually quite a delay in which these things get honed and refined and hammered down, smoothed over somehow into the texts that they become. It's similar with the Buddha, and one of the, he makes people who are sort of studying dependent origination, which if you don't know, I will put a note in the, I mean, there's no reason you should know what dependent origination is necessarily. Suffice it to say, it's this complicated Buddhist thing, very like hard to understand. And the Buddha even talks about how hard it is to understand. So why am I going into this? The reason that I bring up pragmatism is because I'm not going into it because I think it's interesting to learn difficult things. I do have that tendency, and will just warn you. I do like to go for things that are a bit of a struggle for me personally. And I was talking to a friend on a podcast, which I will probably post in the show notes, even though I'm quite embarrassed, not because there's anything wrong with her I don't know. I think I just reveal more about my past in that podcast than I normally do. And so I kind of feel a little self-conscious about that. I will post that podcast nonetheless. That's with my friend Delia Burgess, who's just starting out her podcast, and which you should definitely listen to. So I will post a link to her podcast, and I am her second guest on that podcast. I am clipping as well, which it's bringing out a kind of perfectionist streak where I'm like, on the one hand, I want to be this kind of, I want to be able to just do things ad hoc, try things, fail, etc. And at times my perfectionist comes in and I'm like, oh my God, why do I have to laugh so loud and cause the audio to clip? And it feels very cringe to me. And maybe it will feel cringe to you too, but I will leave that in your capable ears to decide. So going into dependent origination, it seems like this abstract, difficult concept, but in reality, it actually, like, if you look at what the Buddha is saying, it's actually very practical stuff. Like, it's designed to take a specific problem. In fact, it comes about because of arguments that are happening by his followers. And I think we can all relate to the problem of political arguments, whether that's at a large societal scale or whether that's, you know, in a small group of people or friends or whatever, or a company. It's like, yeah, people disagree on things. They become attached to their view, and then they think their view is right. And then this leads to suffering. I think that's a trajectory that, like, that's a simple way to understand why the Buddha starts talking about dependent origination, it's like really practical, right? The issue is people are arguing about what's right and wrong, or arguing about aspects of the Dharma or Dhamma, which is the Buddhist teachings, basically the teachings of the Buddha and the way, the path. I think it's related to the word Tao. Did you know that? I could be wrong about that, but Dharma or Dhamma, I think one is Sanskrit and one is Pali, maybe. Then you hear that Tao, Dharma, and the Chinese word Tao, which means way or path. And I think they are related. Seems kind of important, doesn't it? If you know anything about either of those. And you may not know anything about either of those. So if you do not, then I apologize. By the way, I'm going to be occasionally checking the chat, but just so that you're aware, right now, I am going to just kind of do a bit of a brain dump, and then I'm going to look at the questions in sort of maybe 10 or 15 minutes. So pragmatism, practicality is an easier way of saying it. And yeah, possibly it's just that I'm American and that I'm like, oh, I want something to have practical application, or I want things to have, this kind of like real world consequences or something like that. Other types of philosophy might not have that, but that is something that I'm committed to. So I don't want to remain in this abstract realm. So I started out with the question of like, what is it that I'm working on? And then I got off on a tangent of, it's really hard to describe what I'm working on. It sort of relates to this whole history of how we know things, but it also relates to why do we suffer, but it also relates to this notion of selfhood. I know it sounds like really difficult to follow, but I do think there's like a central core, and it's starting to like come together in my head as like chapters of a book, which is something that I was working on a book a few years ago, on a novel actually, and then the lockdown hit. I could no longer write the novel because I was working. It was a very dialogue heavy novel, very much about London as it was just before the lockdown, and I found it just like too painful, but also like I kind of stopped hearing the voices, or the not voices, but you know what I mean. Like I used to just wake up with conversations in my head that I wanted to kind of work on. And that stopped, actually. Those conversations, which were only in my mind anyway, stopped when the conversations themselves stopped in London. So possibly as a coping mechanism, I ended up going very deep in philosophy. I kind of started out in complexity theory. I was quite interested in Buddhism already. I had been meditating for a while. I got interested in Epicureanism, and I had previously been interested in Stoicism. And these are kind of contrary philosophies, or there's a lot of things that they disagree about. Arguably, there's a lot of things they agree about, actually, too, both coming from, or both not coming from, I would say, but flourishing within the same rough context, which is like the Hellenic or Hellenistic world, between, let's say, I don't know, 400 BC and 280 or something like that. I'm not sure the exact time frames, but you have some late Stoics, you have Roman Stoics. In fact, most of the writing we have from the Stoics is the Romans. That actually goes for the Epicureans too. With Epicurus, we just have these kind of few fragments. So, okay, how does this relate to my overall thing? Well, one is like, it's kind of interesting that these two philosophies that are purportedly incompatible can both be useful. Now, that may not seem that an extreme of a position in this day and age, which is quite committed to sort of, at least parts of it are quite open to and committed to ideas of multiculturalism and ideas that, many cultures have valuable practices and things like that. That was not really true for the Greek Stoics and Epicureans. Like, I don't know the details of it, but like, let's just say that they were not fans of each other. And so they kind of saw their worlds as incommensurate, and basically incompatible is a better way to say it. But because I've been reading Thomas Kuhn, which is a whole other aspect of this, which kind of links some of the complexity thinking to the philosophy stuff. And he writes this word incommensurable, which is basically two worldviews that cannot be, like, someone who's like really in this transitional phase might be able to see the world through like one lens and then the other lens, but it's extremely exhausting and you kind of have to choose one and you end up more or less inhabiting one. I think I'm kind of extrapolating from Thomas Kuhn, who's writing in the 1960s, 70s, to describe what he ends up calling, I don't think he ever uses the term paradigm shift, but this whole idea of a paradigm shift comes from Kuhn's work. I think he talks about switching paradigms rather than shifting. So complexity science, Thomas Kuhn, Structure of Scientific Revolutions is the name of his book. I did a massive Twitter thread on that, like 500 something tweets. Then Epicureanism versus Stoicism, this kind of interesting polarity. And then I ended up going more into like, okay, what about people who see the kind of problems of how we know things? And so I ended up getting interested in the skeptic philosophers. And I'm still quite interested in those, the ancient skeptics, but there are modern skeptics as well. And then skepticism has this interesting relationship with relativism, which is not the same as skepticism. And relativism is also not, even though pragmatists are often accused of relativism, they're not the same thing either. And like, I'll see if I can just summarize those positions, because I might be just throwing around isms that you're like, what are all these things? So skepticism is a doubt that we can know things about the world or reality. And there's kind of two different ways that we can doubt this. One is called ontological, which means just like having to do with the nature of things or having to do with existence. So in the ontological framing, the reason we can't know things about the world is because the world itself is unknowable in some way. And the other way is epistemological, and that's a term I've already used, but it just means like relating to knowledge or how we know things. And so the epistemological branch of skepticism, if you can call it that, because many people deploy both at once, like ontological doubt and epistemological doubt. Basically, there's two ways of doubting that knowledge itself is possible. One is to say that reality is unknowable, and therefore why should we expect any knowledge that we have to be accurate? The other is more to do with like, how do we know things? And it seems like we're not that good at knowing things, or at least not good at knowing them definitively and unambiguously. And so there might be an element that, yeah, actually nature is knowable. It's just the problem that humans can't know it. And just to give you an example I'll try and give an example of each one of those. So ontological would be like, the world is flux. There aren't really categories out there, or reality is non-conceptual in itself. And therefore we can kind of apply these concepts to it, but in fact, we don't really know what's going on out there. That would be like one example of ontological skepticism. So basically just saying, yeah, like things are always changing all the time. We can label them, but we can't know them because there's kind of no objects to know, let's say, or there's nothing stable enough to know. That would be like one argument. And I'm not endorsing this argument. I'm just repeating it. The other, on the epistemological side, would be like, okay, let's say a wind blows. This is like an actual example from classical philosophy. And you say, oh, this wind is really warm. And then I say it's really cold. Well, that seems to already like, let's say we both genuinely, like I genuinely feel cold, you genuinely feel like it's warm. Then we've already come into a problem, you know what I mean? And that's like a very simple example, which is like, what is the truth? Is the wind warm or cold. Now, one, an ontological answer to that question might be, well, it's neither. It's just, that's not how it works. There's not a thing in itself that you can just say one that I'm right and you're wrong, or vice versa. But there's this problem you can maybe see. So I got interested in skepticism. I said I was going to try and summarize a couple other viewpoints. Stoicism, you may be familiar with. It's been quite popular over the past few decades, including in some forms of therapy. I think I could be wrong about this. Mindfulness-based stress reduction is actually more on the Stoic side, because there's some commonalities between Stoicism and Buddhism, and whereas mindfulness-based cognitive therapy comes more from a Buddhist frame. But I should probably just look that up and not be repeating things that are wrong. But Stoicism is this kind of view that starts with the Greeks. Again, it goes into the Romans, and it's kind of this attitude that we, you might know the word Stoic, and it has a little bit to do with that, which is this view that the way to happiness or flourishing, because all of these ancient philosophies are about flourishing. They're about how do we live a good life. And so there's this practical element, again, like I was saying. It's called eudaimonia in Greek. And so that's how do you live the good life? The skeptics would say, well, we actually can't know anything, and therefore the way we get to the good life is to not have any views on anything. They make a comparison like, and I say they, I'm not going to be able to tell you who specifically does this. Maybe it's Pyrrho or something, one of the famous ones. But one, and it might just be repeated in Plato or Aristotle, because even though they're not skeptics, they repeat some skeptical claims and they seem concerned with skepticism. So skepticism proper is a part of the Hellenistic period, meaning that it's like after 300 BC or whatever, like after like Alexander and all that. But there's clearly already like proto-skeptic views in Plato, like that Plato and Aristotle are repeating. So the way towards flourishing for the skeptics is what's called epache, which is going to come back again in the early 20th century, which it basically means the suspension of judgment. So one example they give is that if you actually achieve this kind of skeptical eudaimonia, then the end result is like your attitude towards life is the same as it would be to the question of whether the number of stars is even or odd. And so you might think about that and say, okay, well, is the number of stars even or odd? And then you start thinking, well, there's really a hell of a lot of stars. And then you're like, well, actually, does it really matter? And so this is the skeptical move, to basically be like, to reside in that place of just not knowing anything and get very comfortable there. And once you're there, their understanding or their claim is that you will be happy, basically. And given that on some level, happiness seems to be what we all want, regardless of how different the ways we kind of pursue it are, then, and sorry for the construction noise. I'm not sure if you can hear that. I'm hoping it's not too distracting, but that might be one way of achieving happiness. Stoics kind of see it as like, they're not like super relativist or something. Like they're much more on the objective kind of side, but they're like, look, there aren't problems in the real world. There's only problems in the mind. And so basically our way of viewing things is the problem. Now you might think that sounds quite a lot like skepticism in some ways, but actually I think it's fair to say the Stoics are much more on the side of there is an objective reality. There are gods. We're not that good at knowing them. So maybe a little bit of epistemological skepticism, but not ontological skepticism. And then they just say, look, when we have a problem, that's a problem that we have. So the problem is not, even though we think there is stuff out there and some of it's knowable and that's all good. Typically when we're distressed or upset about something, that's because we like the way to solve that is not by going out and changing something in the world, or at least you may do that, but they think that that's not the way to happiness, right? Because, let's say you're annoyed about, the construction outside. Well, the construction might stop, and then you'll just be annoyed about something else. So in the Stoic view, you've got to actually kind of break this loop by looking at why you're disturbed and kind of focusing on reducing your disturbance. But their method of doing that is not the same as the skeptics. Now, and bear in mind that I'm not an expert in any of these domains. I've read maybe, 4 or 5 books on Stoicism. I've read like 1 or maybe 2 books on Epicureanism, and I'm just reading about the skeptics now. So I'm just kind of like giving you my overall impression, which may or may not be useful, but I'm just talking through how my development over the past few years. So I will link to the Cambridge Companion to Ancient Skepticism, which I'm really loving right now. And I'll link to Stoicism and Epicureanism, including Catherine Wilson's book. I hosted an event with an sort of scholar of, she's a philosopher and professor, and I think she's Professor Emerita. And so she wrote a book it's called The Pleasure Principle in one country, and I think it's called How to Be an Epicurean in another country. As in, I think in the US it's called one, and in the UK it's called the other, but I'll link to that book. So just to continue on that briefly, so Epicureanism is about pleasure. So it basically thinks that if, like, the good life, the eudaimonia thing that I was referring to, flourishing, living like a badass, like awesome life where you're like, I love life. Like that's the feeling that we're going for with eudaimonia, and not necessarily anyway, that's my impression of what they want from eudaimonia. Not like, oh, I've reduced my suffering and things are not so terrible. Sometimes you get that vibe from Stoics, and maybe the skeptical suspension of judgment doesn't sound all that appealing if you're just like, I don't know anything. But you could imagine just that, I know some people who are much more on the skeptical side than I am, who do seem pretty happy. So maybe it's like, hell yeah, this is awesome, whatever's happening. And it's like, what's happening? It's like, I don't know. I mean, like, you could imagine it as being kind of, I don't know, just sort of, I don't know if pre-rational is the right word, but that makes it sound bad, because we tend to have at least in the West, we tend to have this like positive association with rationality. I'm going to challenge that, by the way. And I will not be the first to do so by a long shot, but yeah. And I'm going to, not because I don't think that reason is important, but because I think it is sometimes deployed in cases where it is not called for. So in the same way that I think a hammer is a useful tool, I don't think it's what you should pick up if you're trying to cook something, And so that's my level of anti-rationalism. And there's this idea of post-rationalism on Twitter, but just to come back to Epicureanism, without getting into the post-rationalist debate, I don't think the words are all that important. That's another view that I'm going to try and argue. Epicureanism is about pleasure. So basically the good life is going to have to be a pleasurable one. But before you think that means like some kind of nonstop hedonistic party orgy, bacchanalia or whatever. And if you do think that, then you are in good company, because basically that is what all the Stoics and all the, early Christians, once it came to the Roman period, all thought about Epicurus and about his later transmitter from whom we get a lot of our understanding about what's going on in Epicurus. Epicurus is a Greek living in 300 something BC. Lucretius is a poet living who seems to have access to the Epicurean tradition, which I think was at Herculaneum, and then Herculaneum gets kind of blown up by the explosion of Pompeii. So that's just like an overall view of like where I've been philosophically. And then I've started to get more into like 19th century, 20th century stuff, in particular Schopenhauer, because he was a big influence on Tolstoy. And if you're interested in that, I talked to a friend of mine on another podcast. So I'm going to plug that as well and put that in the show notes. That's Eyal Shai, and he has a podcast called Deep Dive, which is excellent and which you should also listen to. And I will talk about on that podcast, I talked about the connection between literature and philosophy, and I do think they're connected. And another example that maybe I do talk about it on that show, but I don't fully recall talking about it, and that is the link between Epicurus, who's actually quite opposed to poetry, and his later Roman follower Lucretius, who not only is a fan of Epicureanism, but he also writes in verse very self-consciously. He talks about it as like people like reading poetry more than they like reading prose, and therefore we're going to like coat this difficult pill to swallow, which is like Epicureanism, with some kind of honey, which is like the poetry, to try and make this philosophy more durable. And regardless of what you think of poetry, he succeeded, because it's now 2,000 years later, and we still have the poem, which is called De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, and that is still with us today. So whatever he did seems to have worked, basically. He's an interesting guy too. It looks like he was just constantly revising that poem over the whole course of his life. So he's kind of one of these guys that just has one big work, and I could be wrong, and there's others that are lost or something like that, but there is evidence that he was working on it over a very long period, which I always find interesting. These guys that kind of have one main thing that they're always going back to, because I think I'm a little bit like that, even though it's probably frustrating for you and for everyone else, because it's like, get to the point. What's the point? What are you trying to argue? And I actually have struggled. It is this thing I've been working on for the last 2-3 years in terms of the philosophy, but very much like over the last, I think I can say it's about 20 years, that I was about 17 when some of these first ideas started coming to me. So that is where I am now. Nietzsche has been a big part of what I'm doing. It looks like Wittgenstein, Quine. If you're interested in WVO Quine, I did a space with Professor Brian W. Van Norden a few weeks ago, and I will link to that as well. That's on this question of two dogmas of empiricism, which kind of takes this logical positivist thing that's going on at the start of the 20th century and does quite a lot of damage to it by, you could call Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions kind of the nail in the coffin of it, but Quine is working along similar lines in terms of like, what is epistemology? And he's not a skeptic, right? So he's not just saying we can never know anything, but he's like, rather than going for this, traditionally within the West, there's this thing called the correspondence theory of truth, which is basically the whole job of philosophy. Like, it's kind of like a presupposition that whatever's out there, because we seem to have these concepts, abstract concepts in our mind. And when we talk about knowledge, those concepts seem to be what we talk about. We can talk about knowledge of very specific individual people or things or artworks. I mean, artworks are very specific, right? But in general, when we talk about knowledge of something, it's kind of this more abstract, like knowing categories, knowing when to do a certain thing in given a situation. Like, expert knowledge seems to be somehow, you could say that expert knowledge to some degree is about how to do something. And within Greek, there's different words for this. Like, there's a kind of word techne, which is like about the technical ability to do something. Then there's episteme, which is like about knowing about how to do something. And then there's other things like praxis and phronesis and phronesis. I can't pronounce Greek, and we'll try to stop trying. But yeah, where was I going with that? So So the correspondence theory, which is very much present in Plato's Socrates, at least. So Plato writes down these dialogues, often including Socrates and other interlocutors. And Socrates seems to have this presupposition that the way reality is, or the way that the things that we care about are, is that they are conceptually coherent. And that if we spend enough time working on talking about these things, we will get a better understanding, like an exhaustive account of what a concept means. And there's a kind of like implicit assumption that there is this kind of, I mean, I guess it comes together more in Plato, this kind of world of forms or something, or world of ideas. And so I'm not so much, I'm not so au fait with all that. I'm not going to like go make claims on Plato's behalf, but I think what I can say is that this idea of the correspondence theory of truth, that basically there is this reality out there, that it's more or less conceptual in its structure, and that language, which is also conceptual, maps onto it neatly. And the job of philosophy, therefore, is to kind of try and get our concepts to correspond to the reality out there. And that's a dominant mode, at least of Western philosophy, for at least from the time of Socrates, let's say, to the time of Nietzsche. So, and you could say Rimbaud. This is when Steiner thinks it comes into question. The French poet in the 1870s. Nietzsche's writing sort of 1860s, 70s, 80s. I think he stops writing in the 1880s, and he goes slightly mad, which is potentially a cautionary tale. So just coming back to this issue of truth. Okay, so where am I coming from now? I'm going against the correspondence theory of truth. There are many who have done this, and there's different modes in which they've done this. I am going against logic as a part of nature. So logic is a great tool. We use it all the time, but there's a bunch of big projects at the end of the 19th, early 20th century that are trying to say that, look, we can discover logic in the world, and therefore we don't need to pretend that it's an axiom. My view is you do need to pretend it's an axiom. This in turn is going to lead me to question mathematics, and not whether mathematics are internally consistent, because I'm sure that there's lots of things that are good and useful and important about mathematics, including stuff that applies to the real world. But what I'm going to go against is the idea that reality is itself mathematical. So I will definitely agree that there are patterns in nature, and they are important, and they're what allow us to kind of not just know anything, but actually to exist at all. If there were no order, if there were no kind of predictability at all in nature, then it would be hard to see how a planet could cohere or life could occur on that planet. There have to be patterns. There absolutely must. But whether those patterns, it's a question of what's called mathematical realism. The question is whether those patterns actually are themselves mathematical. Like, it's a question of, are numbers, which we know are abstract, right? Numbers are abstractions. You never see the number 5. You only see, the closest you come is seeing 5 of the same object. Now, those objects that you may notice are not actually the same. They can't be if there's 5 of them. And so you're attributing, so there's this question in mathematical realism: are you discovering the pre-existing number of 5 that exists out there, and there's some way through reason or science or mathematics or logic or whatever that we can say, yep, the number 5 is definitely a thing. It exists either in this abstract realm, or it doesn't, or you don't need the abstract realm, but it does exist as in this conceptual realm. It's real. In other words, 5 is real somewhere, somehow. And it's not just us saying, oh, hey, there's 5 apples and there's also 5 pears. And there's something similar about these two situations. That I definitely agree with. But is there some kind of pre-existing fiveness that exists independently of whether humans exist at all? Now, a mathematical realist would say, yes, there is something inherent about the number, that like the universe is this thing of 5s and 2s and whatever else. And it's not something we attribute, but something we discover. It's not something we invent. It's something we discover. Now, I'm going to try and argue that that's not coherent, and that there's a lot of attempts to do this throughout the 20th century. And as far as I know, they all fail, basically. So this attempt to ground mathematics within logic and logic within nature, that fails, in my view. And yet it's kind of widely understood that because mathematics is so useful, it must be a part of the universe. Now, my view is that that is not necessarily true. So like, it's, to me, and this is, I'm giving you my original like thinking and philosophy, and I'm certainly not, it's original in the sense that it's coming together for me and it's a live thing for me. I'm certainly not the first one to argue this, and I'm certainly not, going to be able to, like, well, we'll see where I get with it, basically. Like, I may not be able to persuade you that this is true. And as in, this is very, very early draft. I've had discussions with friends and they don't, like, it's down to my own weakness that they can't even really see what I'm trying to argue. What I'm trying to argue is something like, you get into the kitchen, right? And you're like, I need to boil water. And then you're like, there's actually like several ways I could put it into a pot and put the pot on the stove or in the oven or some other source of heat. I could, put it in the kettle and boil the kettle. And you kind of think that because it's such an omnipresent thing within the kitchen, that there must be, like, we must always have had this, right? We must always have been able to boil water. If that were true, then there could never have been this kind of discovery or invention of fire, right? So like you look at other animals, they don't seem to have control of fire. It seems to be quite important that we did get this control. And therefore, even though we live in this world where I can just say to you, oh, could you make me a cup of tea? And it requires almost zero brain power from you. That is not baked into the universe. I'm not saying that there isn't boiling water at some point in history, but more like we have this tendency to just forget that things have cultural origins. And so my view is that mathematics is like this, and it's not that it's not useful. So like, just as the knife in the kitchen is useful, but the knife in the kitchen has this long history of having been useful in different forms. And that's what makes it so important for us. It's not that knifeness or the quality of being knife-like is somehow pre-exists humans, let's say. It would be very hard to understand. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's a bad example, because you could think of certain types of cleaving, or, you could think of in single-celled organisms, some potential like analogs to what, even with DNA, we talk about this, like snipping and stuff like that. But of course, that idea of snipping is kind of related to this idea of scissors. And this idea of scissors is kind of like related to the idea of like two knives, right? And so the question is like, are we discovering some knife-like element in reality and then discovering that everywhere? Or is it something that we invented, and because we like to use metaphors all the time, it's something that we attribute to other things? Again, this is not saying, like, the question here is not whether is mathematics useful in I was thinking about it this morning, like telling how tall a tree is. Like trigonometry is like very good at those kind of things. But again, that's a kind of thing, like, does a tree conceptually have a notion of how tall it is? We know that it matters for the tree. Like, our conception of height for the tree matters for the tree because, it may need to reach above these other kind of plants in order to get more sunlight. But if we take Darwin seriously, this is not how the height of trees was achieved. You know what I mean? It's not achieved in this teleological way. And teleology is one of the last things that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about, so this idea that there is an end goal, so telos. I was just looking at this yesterday because I was very surprised to learn. I was speaking to a friend of mine about the word talisman, and it turns out that talisman has this connection to the word telos. And I will link to the very brief tweet I did about this. And talisman, telos, it comes into English in the 20th century, I think, from Greek. And in Greek, it means, maybe I should just look it up so that I'm not just saying the wrong things. Here we go. Talisman. So we got talisman from telos, teline. Interesting. Teline, originally in Greek, ancient Greek, completion. And there's this sense in telos of the end, limit, goal, fulfillment, or completion. Interestingly, teline also means perform, as in religious rites, and pay, as in taxes, and fulfill. So it's basically to kind of complete, fulfill, end, sort of. It's an end. It's what we're going for. It's the goal, right? That's what telos is. Now, it comes from, and so if you hear me saying teleology, some people have listened to my podcast where I'm like, I'm against teleology, and they're like, we don't know what teleology is. So that's my fault, because I shouldn't be just throwing around, these complicated terms without actually explaining what they mean. Because again, these are tools. These are culturally contingent tools that have a history, and I will demonstrate that right now by saying that the Proto-Indo European root. So this is like the Proto-Indo European is this kind of reconstructed, imagined language that we infer from all the current languages that we know that are related today through this Indo-European thing. So it relates languages like Greek, Sanskrit, English, like these Germanic languages are also Indo-European. I think Hittite is, if that matters to you, is also Indo-European. And so this Proto-Indo-European is this idea that it's an idea that's similar to saying, like, okay, well, we think that dogs and wolves are related. And so we think that Sanskrit and modern English are related. So they must have had a common ancestor. So we say, we're going to go back this wolf dog lineage and see if there's like something back there. Now, with animals, we can find remains, or we can find paleontological evidence that there were these earlier forms of both, dogs and wolves, and that maybe at some point they were more closely related, or maybe we can even find what we think to be the common ancestor. With language, we can't do this, right? Because we only have writing, as I said. I can't remember where I said this, but I said this recently. It's only been a few, it's not that old, basically. In fact, I said it on another podcast that I was on, my friend Joao. So that podcast is not out yet, but if you remind me, DM me on Twitter, please get in touch about if I say something and you're like, oh, I want to know more about that. Please comment on this video, like this video, subscribe to this video. I am very much in search of conversation partners. And that's one of the reasons that I'm doing these videos, to try to just open up what I'm up to a little bit. Now, teleology is another thing that I'm going to oppose, not because I don't have goals. I have the goal of putting out a YouTube video, which is now what I'm doing. What I don't think is that nature has goals. And so, in the same Darwinian way, it's not that we have eyes because we needed to see, and therefore this whole complicated eye thing came out. It's because of these random chance mutations that just over enough time accrue, and these small changes of like, this is better than that, and those might be, maybe they're big changes that all happen at once and then they turn out to be advantageous and we take them. But in any case, the point is that they don't come from some drive towards something. They don't, like, our eyes are not there for us to see. That's not what brought about eyes, if you take Darwinian reasoning seriously. What happened instead is a series of random events where we don't get to see all the failed experiments. And so Proto-Indo European it's kind of like using Darwinian logic, right? Like, we see these things that exist now. They must have at some point been related in the past. Now, to bring it back to telos, Proto-Indo European has this root quell, Kwel, which means revolve, move around, sojourn, or dwell. So revolve, move around, sojourn, like go on a journey, or dwell. And it says perhaps via the notion of a turning point, which is pretty interesting, of a course or field. Now, it's probably the case that it's this dwelling sense that links quell to telos. So we've got revolve, move around, sojourn, or dwell, leading to the end, limit, goal, fulfillment, or completion. Now, my view is that the way that this transformation quite likely happened, and this is not from any kind of evidence, it's just my gut feeling, is that probably dwell is what led to this idea of the end. So basically, you've got this journey, you're on the journey, you're revolving, you're moving around, but the end goal is to like stay in a place. And so if quell has this sense of dwelling, a dwelling place, that's the ultimate goal. And that is extremely human, right? To want to get to the place where finally you can rest. And this is kind of like driving everything in a certain way, right? Why do there's jokes about this, like that writers don't like writing, they just like having written. And I could say that about the end of this video. Why am I doing it? Well, so that after the video, I'll feel like, okay, that's done, right? And so telos, right? Goal, that's my goal. Now, and I'm not going to get into talisman at this moment, but it is interesting that talisman has this idea of kind of not just consecration ceremony, but also fulfillment or, end. Now, going against teleology involves saying that nature doesn't have goals. And so, and that goals are things that are human, very human, as I said, and very important to us, but possibly misleading when we think about either nature itself or evolution, the way that organisms change, or cultural evolution, the way that human things change, or even human perception, which is that this is going to be a much longer argument that I'm going to work on to argue that our understanding of how perception works in the naive mode is teleological and it's actually misinformed. And the final thing, I'm also going to try and historicize logic and basically say, here's how it comes together. Schopenhauer had a go at this. I think he comes to the wrong conclusion, actually. And so he comes to a teleological conclusion, and he opposes many of the thinkers that he's aware of, specifically Lucretius, whom I mentioned, the Epicurean philosopher. And the reasons that they're anti-teleological is complicated, but I can talk about that at some other point. Francis Bacon and Spinoza. And you may have heard me mention Spinoza before. So he looks at those people who are teleological and he opposes their view. So he opposes the anti-teleological view in favor of the dominant teleological view, which is that, of course, nature has goals. Look at the perfection it's produced. And then the final thing is this idea of truth, of abstract truth. And I'm going to have to I'm just going to give a teaser at the moment. This is not, I thought I was going to talk about the health model of inquiry. I'm going to actually relabel that, I think, because really what I'm talking about now is it's almost like strands I oppose in Western philosophy. Let's call it that. And I think that has like relabeled it on this stream, which will be cool if that's worked. And so I'm going to post the show notes. So logic is another one. Abstract truth, which is like, is when we say something's true, this is true, this is true, this is true. Is there some actual commonality between those things that we call true? Now, this came up in a podcast, and I may be repeating myself. Is the way that this flame is beautiful, the same way that a painting is beautiful? Like, or am I describing a similarity in my experience of those things? Is beauty out there in some kind of abstract way? And I would ask the same of truth, which is when I say that it's true that this candle is in front of me, which I regard as true, and I say that it's true that Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, are those true in the same sense? You might say yes. At the same time, one is kind of like, the way I'm verifying it is like, okay, it's here in front of me. The way I'm verifying that Darwin did this thing is basically just trusting that, this book that I have and the story that I've heard from many different sources is reliable. And true probably starts out as an adjective and as something that is reliable, like a tree. They're etymologically related. And so I meant to get on to my own new philosophy, because like, I'm not going to just one issue with a lot of the thinkers that I'm looking at and going to reference, and what people kind of attribute to post-modernity or some of the critiques from the 20th century, is that they kind of break your way of thinking and then just leave you with the pieces. And that's something that I don't want to do. So basically, I want to come up with something that actually is useful, makes sense, and doesn't just say, it doesn't collapse into relativism. I'm quite opposed to relativism. So I don't think that once you undermine this solid truth, then everything's up for grabs. That's definitely not what I think. At the same time, I think those critiques haven't been absorbed and put into like a positive program that's coherent. Now, I'm sure what I'm saying is not strictly true. I'm sure people have attempted this and many have probably been successful, but I feel the need to do it myself. So I'm going to try and do that as well. That is where I'm going to leave you today. If you liked this, please contact me on Twitter and tell me. That would be great. Or comment on this video. That would be amazing. I would love to hear from you. I am posting my Twitter there. And I'm also going to share a link to my Patreon. I am in danger of like starting to go and work in construction, actually, speaking of the construction outside. So if you would like to support what I'm up to, you can find me on Patreon. I also have the same Brian Cam thing. I've also got a podcast, which I will post here. I haven't posted to it in a couple of weeks, but I'm going to be posting something hopefully this week. I just have all kinds of things. I think you can find most of it from my Twitter. So so Patreon is where I'm like now posting everything that I do. So if I do something and you want to know about it, you can find out on Patreon. And of course, that is motivated also by my desire to have some kind of income. And the other aspect of this is Substack. So if you just want occasional updates about what I'm doing and you don't use Twitter or whatever, I am also on Substack, and I'm just the same place everywhere. So hopefully one or more of those links is useful to you. I would love to hear from you if you do watch this, and if you are interested in any of the things that I'm talking about. I know they can seem quite abstract. I'm trying to come out of my, philosophy hole, as I think of it, and make something relevant and interesting and exciting. And to do that, I need to have conversations. I'm also trying to like put something out into the world so that other people have some clue of what I'm up to. And that's what this video has attempted to do. I'm probably going to do another one on what I originally titled this stream, which is the health model of inquiry. I need to learn whether it's actually inquiry or inquiry. Which one do we say? Which one do you say? You can let me know which way you say it. I am going to end this stream because I need to get going, but thank you for watching it. And I hope that it at least sets the background of the things that have been bothering me. And I'm going to then go on to try and give more of a description of what I think is a better way of looking at the world, the universe, philosophy, everything, than the correspondence theory of truth. So I'm going to end this stream. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.